Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Before we begin tonight's lecture, apropos of our topic this year about wildfire, we have an announcement of an event that's coming up very soon.
Thanks, Jeff. I'm Jan Holm with Montana Elders for Livable Tomorrow, MELT. And tomorrow evening at 5 o'clock in this very room, MELT is putting on a program called Wildfires Ready or Not. It's a program about emergency preparedness before the wildfire season begins. Dr. Jack Cohen, who's been a research scientist at the Missoula Fire Lab for at least 2 decades, he's been studying wildfire behavior and wildfire disasters where large wildfires and human habitation converged. And he's been studying to determine the causes of such disasters and why the homes that burned. Some of his conclusions will surprise you. He'll tell you what you can do before a wildfire to improve your home's chance of surviving a major burn. Other topics will be a film, Unacceptable Risk, Smart 911, a low fire survival story, insurance issues, how neighbors working together can make a difference. If you can't make it tomorrow, there will be another event in 2 weeks in Grant Creek at the Best Western Hotel, and that one is happening at 7 o'clock. So tomorrow, 5 o'clock here. Hope to see you then. Thanks.
The snow's not even all gone, and we're already planning for our forest fire, wildfire season. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Jeff Badnock, and on behalf of our lecture series organizing committee, our amazing Alumni Association staff, and our lecturers, I'm proud and happy to welcome you to our 3rd lecture series of the 20th Annual Alumni Association Community Lecture Series. This series was developed over 20 years ago to deepen UM and community ties by showcasing UM's faculty lecturing about their fields of research in a series of talks more or less centered around a central theme. It takes a great deal of time and effort on the part of the Alumni Association staff and our lecturers to put these together. So if you have an opportunity, thank the lecturers, thank the Alumni Association. Show them your support, send them some money. As always, each lecture concludes with a question and answer series. So if something occurs to you during the lecture, hold on to that thought, and at the conclusion of the lecture, you'll have an opportunity to ask your question to our speakers. Because our lectures are recorded by MCAT with a community, I always forget this, a media assistance grant from MCAT, it's important that you use the microphone so that we capture your question on the recording. Does anyone need to be reminded about silencing their phones? Because now's the time to do that if you haven't already done that. This year's lecture series topic is Beyond the Headlines, Clearing the Air with Real Evidence. The series began 2 weeks ago, and last week we heard a lecture delivered by Professor Philip Higuera. Professor Higuera described the deep history of wildfire, in particular in the western areas. We learned that fire has been with us a long time. We learned some of the changes that have occurred to the landscape because of fire. This week we'll focus our attention on the human health impacts of wildfire on humans as Professor Brent Ruby and Professor Paul Smith describe their findings of their research. Brent Ruby is a repeat lecturer in the community lecture series, and he serves as the director of the Montana Center for Work Physiology and Exercise Metabolism. Sometime, if you can, get him to describe the research he did centered around the Lewis and Clark Core of Discovery. And I think there was some statistic about the men on the Core of Discovery eating 5 pounds of meat a day in order to sustain their caloric needs. But it's pretty cool research. Dr. Smith is not only an adjunct professor in the School of Community and Public Health at the University of Montana. He is also director of the Pediatric Intensive Care Unit and Pulmonology at Community Medical Center. While our seasonal wildfires are a relentless nuisance for many of us, to the more vulnerable among us, the aged, the very young, and differently abled, it is a health crisis that demands both prevention and coping strategies in order to stay healthy or even alive. Dr. Smith will talk about the health implications of wildfires in the broader community context. Please join me in welcoming Professor Brent Ruby and Dr. Paul Smith as they present their lectures on wildfire implications for firefighter and community health. Dr. Ruby.
Well, all this chatter about monitoring fire behavior, I don't monitor fire behavior, but man, it's kind of interesting to monitor firefighter behavior. That's sometimes a challenge. So I'm going to share with you a different direction that focuses on how these crews are impacted by the season. So I've been chasing fire crews for 20 years now, trying to collect every kind of human sample imaginable in every kind of situation. And I have loads of really interesting stories and awesome stories with the crews that we've worked with. But I'm going to add this to my title, which is studying the frontline tactical athletes that these characters are. So they have a unique charisma to them. They have a unique demand, and I'll talk about all of those things and how they relate to their own maintenance of their health and safety on the line, and things that we've done to try to develop countermeasures to make the job just a little bit safer and to prevent some of the hazards that crop up routinely. So I've been in fire for a long time, chased a lot of different crews, had a lot of different awesome experience with crews, and a lot of laughs over what kind of samples we were going to collect and what we needed to collect them and when we needed to collect them. So one thing I have noticed, though, is the job is vastly different across a wide range of different crews. The physical demands are different, the hours are different, the threats are different. And so, and that happens in all of the crews that we've studied, males and females in all types of crews. And so the one thing that is a big shout out to sort of my home team, which is the Lolo Hotshots. I've worked with them for 20 years, lots of different great stories with them. They've always been super supportive of our research, but one thing I have learned is that there's just no space on the fire line for laboratory implications that can't stand up to that environment. If I can't take results that I pull out of studies with humans in the laboratory and try and superimpose them to here's how you should work out on the line without studying them actually out on the line. And one of the things I'm most proud of with all the research that we've done is all of it's done on real fires. So we go to the same assignments that the crews are at. We chase them on those fires, drive into them. We've taken helicopter rides in to get urine samples and nude body weights, which is a whole different story. But it's become sort of my passion to serve, to develop sort of an advocate stance for the health and safety of these crews. And anything we can do that uses evidence-based techniques, those should be deployed. And the things that are being done occasionally with how they're fed and how their work-rest ratios might work, some of those things need some reconsiderations based on the science. So we started a long time ago first wanting to get a glimpse at what the overall energy demands of the job were. We wanted to know what we were up against. What does this cost? What does this job even cost? How hard is it? Everybody says it's hard. They look tired when they come off the line. They don't smell very good. So something must be going on. So we used a two-stable isotope tracer technique, which is a really elegant way to measure energy expenditure in free-range animals or free-range firefighters or humans. And so it's pretty simple in theory. It's quite expensive to deploy the doses, but they're just oral doses that are delivered once, and then the timing is sort of everything, like most things in science. But then you collect urine samples and body weights periodically, and we can do a very accurate calculation over, say, 3 days, 4 days, 7 days. What's the total energy cost of this scenario? So we went to several fires across the country, mostly in the West, but we did make it to Florida for a fire back in 97 or 8. But we wanted a representation of a wide range of fires so we could build a foundation to work off of. There's no sense in telling firefighters how much they should eat without knowing what the overall expenditure is. And so we wanted a variety of fires to get that glimpse. And we've done this a couple of different times over, once in the late 90s and then 15 years later, to look and see if the job was indeed still hard, and it is. So the first study we did, and in comparison to one that we followed up 15 years later, it's incredible how calibrated these firefighters are. They know when they can afford to work hard. They know when they should throttle back, and they know that based not necessarily on the training, but on the experience that they've accumulated in the field. They know that the last thing they should do is blow up on the hike into the fire. And yet that sometimes is the hardest part of the day in terms of what we can measure in the lab. So they have to pace themselves into the fire, and then the real fun begins, and that's where things get somewhat unpredictable. So we are, with this technique, the neat thing is we can get an overall picture. From that, then we can start to stack blocks of evidence on top of that foundation to figure out, okay, what's the best strategy that we can use to feed them so that they don't fatigue. It's not like at noon a whistle blows out in the forest and everyone says, oh, sweet, let's take a break, let's open our sack lunches and all celebrate. It's lunchtime. It doesn't work that way. It shouldn't work that way. We shouldn't be feeding these athletes that way. And so this foundation showed that the energy expenditure is highly variable. There are low working assignments where the energy expenditure may be 3,000 calories a day, sometimes lighter than that in a smaller individual, because larger individuals obviously are going to expend a larger number of calories to get them through the day. But we'll see ranges in our early study. We were seeing ranges up to about 6,000 or so. We did see some numbers as high as 7,000 kcals in 24 hours. And I don't care who you are, if you're camping and trying to throw down 7,000 calories, it's going to be a challenge. And you better damn well like the food you're eating, because if you don't like it, you still got to put it down there. Otherwise, the muscle is completely lacking in what it desperately needs. So when we followed them up again, there's different ways we can slice this up now, but we can slice it up per day. But usually we look at the overall and then divide by the total number of days from our bookend urine samples that we've captured at the very beginning and the very end. So we're seeing ranges, I mean, roughly an average of about 4,500 to 5,000 calories a day. That's sort of the foundation. So we know the job is hard. End of story. We don't need to do these studies anymore because we know the job is hard, unless they're integral to some of the other questions. But this is the best way to do it. You cannot put a Fitbit on a firefighter and say, what was your energy expenditure? How many steps did you get? Are you still healthy? It does. Most of the instrumentation that we have used and others have tried to use in terms of monitoring individuals, those systems will break in this environment. And usually they're quite expensive, and most of them are not very valid whatsoever. So we know that the job is hard. This is some really interesting data because we have used some really high-end monitoring systems thanks to some colleagues within the Army. We have a really neat agreement with them that allows us, it's supposed to be a two-way agreement, but so far we're the only ones that borrow their stuff. They don't call us and say, hey, can we borrow all your equipment? They have a lot more cool toys. So they've sent us monitors, everything from these physiological monitors that we can put on, which is the picture on the very front screen, or we've used Camelback systems that have computer flow meters in them, so we know every time they took a drink how much they drank and all that stuff. We can give ingestible sensors to monitor body temperature throughout the day. We can do all of that pretty easily. But one thing with this is you'll notice here's the percentage of the work shift, and here's the average heartbeat in beats per minute. And you can see that a large percentage of their day is spent in these moderate to lower intensity zones. And there's good reason for that, because it's not like they're just going out there and saying, oh, I think I'll hike to the top of Mount Sentinel today. What can I afford my heart rate to get to? Oh, pretty high, because I know it's only there and my car's right here. Out on the line, they don't know if it's going to be a 12-hour shift, a 16-hour shift, a 24-hour shift. And they certainly don't know what the fire behavior is going to do. And so they have to be very careful to use their governor smart and not overdo it too fast. Otherwise, they'll overheat. And the real reason that they have problems with heat-related injury on the fire line has nothing to do with how much fluid they consume. It has everything to do with how much metabolic heat they produce and are able to offload. So they're highly calibrated. They're more calibrated than most of the instrumentation that we can put on them. Okay? So we're not in the business of telling them how to do their job. No way. And we're also not really in the business of telling them how to train for their job. Because as much as we can measure them in the lab, they're the ones out in the field knowing what they do day to day to day to day to day. Okay? So they don't spend a lot of time at those high intensities. When they do is when they get into trouble. Okay? Because it's very hard. In order for you to be able to offload the heat that you produce, you have to first get it through the clothing, get it to the environment where you can release it. Well, if the environment is as hot as it typically is out on these incidents, you're producing heat. There's no real good exchange of that heat. So it ends up being trapped in the body, on the body, and that's when the core temperature can rise to threatening levels. So I put this on there as a topic. Is there an agency-wide drinking problem in terms of trying to reduce heat-related injury? You may think that heat-related injuries like heat exhaustion, heat stroke, is a common event out on the line, that it doesn't happen that frequently. But when it does, it can create an immediate emergency situation, and those crew members need to get off the line very quickly. Now all of a sudden, it's not fire suppression, it's emergency evacuation. And that becomes threatening not just to that one individual, but maybe to a whole group of individuals. Because there may not be a place for the helicopter to come in, so they might have to cut that, and it distracts them from their normal day-to-day or normal tasks. But the reason I put this up here is we have measured water turnover with the same tracer methods over and over and over in a lot of different fires over several different days. And what we have noticed is these guys, this is over 5 days. So they lose a kilogram of body weight over 5 days. We have a measure of total body water before and after that 5-day window. And in this data set, which is about 18 people or so, they lost a kilogram of water, or a liter of water. Well, the measurement technique allows us to quantify how much water is coming into the system and how much water has left the system. You can probably imagine how and where and why these guys lose water. A big part of that is sweat production. So sweat production, which helps keep the body cool throughout the day, urine production, and so on. That's where they lose the water. But it's actually quite impressive how well they put it back. This is another bit of evidence to show you how calibrated they are. Because over 5 days, their energy expenditure is about 5,000 calories a day. Their water intake budget to be in complete balance would be 35 liters based on these isotope dilution calculations. So that's about 7 liters a day in 5 days. They're 1 liter shy of perfect in 5 days. So instead of taking in 35 liters to be perfect, they scored a 34 out of 35. That's pretty darn good for not running around with a scale or a graduated cylinder and trying to do all these calculations to figure out just how much they need to take. We see these numbers time and time again, not just on this fire, but on several of them. So over the course of all these different fires, with a larger number of subjects here and there, we see a range of water turnover or fluid demands that are flexible and somewhat dependent on what the operation demands, how hard is the job, how much hiking they have to do carrying that load, and how hot it is. Okay, so the average is about 7.5 liters per 24 hours, and this is over a lot of days. So we're pretty confident in telling crews, hey, it's not, you don't have to freak out too badly about, am I going to get dehydrated out there? You probably won't. There might be pockets of times where you experience some of that, but these guys, again, they'll come right back and they'll return to normal. They do an amazing job, and we've seen that time and time again. We have had one situation where a firefighter in one of the studies, completely unrelated to the methodology that we were using, had a heat exhaustion situation. So he collapsed from heat exhaustion. We were monitoring temperature at the time as a function of this study. And this is one where we had the computer camelbacks in place. So he's consuming copious amounts of water, trying to offset the heat that he is producing from the metabolic loads that he's creating from how hard he's working. And the safety message routinely to these crews is, hey, it's going to be hot out there, so you better make sure you hydrate. Hydrate, 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 hydrate. That's so important. Make sure you do it. I mean, that message permeates through our whole society these days. There's so many individuals of all ages that are freaked out that if I don't pay attention, I'm going to get dehydrated. If I get dehydrated, all hope is lost. And we know with these firefighters that that's not the case. But his fluid intake was very aggressive, almost 2.5 liters in a 2-hour window at the time just prior to his collapse. So he's trying to drink himself to safety, and it's not working. And this happens time and time again with these crews. If there is a heat exhaustion situation, the majority of time that happens, the hydration status is normal in the individual. They've just overproduced massive amounts of heat. And we use a little accelerometer system in their yellow shirts that sort of keeps track of their movement patterns. It's sort of like a Fitbit on steroids. It's a much more sensitive system. We can't put it out on the wrist because they'll lose it, break it, or it gets vibrated by a chainsaw or a tool. So we put it in their pocket. This guy that went down had the highest numbers that we've ever recorded. So we're very confident that the rationale for his heat exhaustion was not he didn't drink enough. We know exactly how much he drank, but he worked himself senseless. So the muscle produces monstrous amounts of heat when it's very active. And when the environment is super hot on the outside, it's very hard for you to get rid of that. And so it builds and it builds and it builds until dangerous levels, and then there's collapse. So it can be very dangerous. It's very rare to see this. But anyways, so these guys, this is my term for this group. I don't know what else to call them. I don't like to just call them tactical athletes. I don't like to call them power athletes. They got a little bit of everything. They're like the most badass off-road motorcycle with all the gear you want for 5 days or whatever. So they're like a tactical ultra-enduro power athlete that has to sometimes fight off wolves, according to this old Smokey story. So another countermeasure that we've tried to identify is, what if we feed them a little bit differently? We know how hard it is for them to work. We know that they don't really like the sack lunches. We know that they could eat better. But the big thing is, I'm more interested in not making sure they eat healthy all the time. I'm more concerned that they have a large number of regular eating episodes throughout the work shift. And the only way you're going to convince somebody to do that is if they like at least a little bit what they're consuming. If they don't like it, the Army's shown this over and over and over with rations. Oh, we know the Army Rangers need 5,000 calories a day. Here you go. Here's a 5,000 calorie a day ration. It's all packed up nice and tight. Just take it out there and just eat it. You'll be in balance then. Well, they take it out and they routinely come back. And it's like, how come you didn't eat it all? Well, A, it's not very good. B, I didn't have time. C, it's too inconvenient. I have to open it up. I had to do this and heat it up, and I didn't like it, and so they don't consume it. So we've shown that with lots of different things, but it's not that easy. It's highly tactical, and the logistics are very difficult to feed them. When these are the locations of the catering crews here in the West that focus on this catering contract, and it's the primary countermeasure to prevent fatigue on the line is this catering contract. So the only thing these firefighters have as tools to keep themselves healthy is the fitness they bring to the table on day one and whatever is available as a nutritional countermeasure as part of the contract. It's not cheap to feed these crews. So the sack lunch alone is quite costly. And if you were to open it up and look at it, you'd think, really? How does it cost that much? Doesn't make sense. But logistically, it's incredible to watch one of these tents or watch one of these camps become assembled almost overnight. And the services that are provided to make it safer and a cleaner environment for these crews is pretty impressive. But hotshot crews are notorious for saying, we don't like staying in the camp. We like staying outside the camp or up by the fire. And when that happens, now the feeding strategies and the tactical nutrition takes on a different form. And it's considerably more challenging to get them fed correctly. Okay? All of these stresses are happening, and we haven't even mentioned the environment except for the heat. We know how hard the job is. We know that it's hot. We know that heat stress is an issue. We know that they have to have the right fitness going into it. We know that the diet is compromised. We probably, just looking at the way that these camps are set up, sleeping is not always optimal. There's some stress involved. And then on top of that, we're going to throw some smoke at you. So all of these things combined create a whole plethora of stresses that they have to manage and deal with. And the only countermeasure that we have to throw at it to keep them safer right now is, well, here's some advice on maybe how to get a little bit fitter at the beginning of the season. But they're already pretty fit, especially hotshot crews. And here are some nutritional strategies that you can deploy to make the job a little bit better. We've done those feeding studies. We've done ration studies with the Army to look at that. We know that when they're fed regularly, they self-select a slightly higher work output, and they're more vigilant, and they pay attention more on the fire line. That is super important late in the day when the fire behavior starts to kick up. The last thing you want is at 10 hours into the work shift, oh, I didn't eat very well today. I'm pretty tired. Well, 10 hours into the work shift is when bad stuff happens, because that's when the fire behavior can really start to become aggressive, because it started to get drier, it's starting to get hotter, and now they really have to pay attention. Okay? So eating episodes or increasing the number of eating episodes on the line is absolutely key. And we've shown that over and over and over in these feeding studies. These are some of the things that show up in those sack lunches. And so it's not always the greatest stuff. And last year I went to a meeting at the USDA Human Nutrition Labs with a group from the Army Military Nutrition Team to try to put together some strategy for addressing the catering contract. And what can we learn from the Army, who's done an amazing job? I mean, military nutrition in the Army is pretty incredible, the studies that they've done with the warfighter. But I'm very close with that community and have collaborated on multiple projects with them. So we all met in Maryland. Well, on my way, I thought, man, I need some information to give to these USDA laboratory scientists to show what we're up against. And so I'm texting crews here in Montana, I'm texting crews in California, and I said, hey, send me some pictures of the sack lunches so we can have an interesting discussion about those. This is the leftovers collected by 9 crew members out of 20 over 5 days. So this box is about this big, this deep, this wide, and anything that they don't eat that's not perishable gets thrown into this box, and then crews can pick and choose, and I'm a little bit hungry. I've got a hankering for a big, fat, juicy pickle. Whatever. But this is one of the quotes that one of those crew members texted me. I've edited part of it, but they think of how many calories should be in the lunch, so they put in a bunch of candy bars and other celery sticks, and paydays don't really cut the mustard. So one complaint from one hotshot in California. So things that we hope to strategize moving forward. As we feel like we've answered quite a bit of questions by being out with these crews, but there's always a gap in the knowledge. There's always more to consider. I absolutely love talking to crews and talking with crews and say, here's what we found. Does this fit with what you guys feel over the course of the season? What are some questions you guys have? What are some concerns operationally that we could embed into these designs? It is not that exciting for me. I mean, I love coming up with study designs. I love doing that. I love working with students. I love working with young researchers that want to try to fit everything into a single study. I absolutely love that part of my job. But with the world of fire and some of these tactical athletes, I don't like coming up with these questions without consulting that community. Because the last thing I want to do is to design a study that I think would be really cool, but has no relevance to what their operational needs are. So steps moving forward, we have some collaborative potential with I have a colleague in Alaska that's got some really neat tools at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. But these are sort of the stresses and the composite of what these crews deal with. I only chose this picture because I thought that guy's beard was pretty cool. I also really like the parallel between the energy demands of this job and the energy demands of that little bike race in France. In that little bike race in France, only one rider gets to wear the yellow jersey. Every one of these guys gets to wear the yellow jersey. And I can guarantee you that these yellow jerseys smell a lot worse than the ones in France. But we know what the external loads are that they carry. We know the shift length. We know what their aerobic capabilities are. We know that increasing the number of eating episodes means more work, more vigilance, and a more stable blood glucose profile. We've given kits to crews, and they collect their own samples periodically on the line to document all that. We know that the current lunch program is, I chose a different word, but I chose deficient. Hotshot crews in California may choose a different one. We know that what the hikes cost getting to the line. The crew at MTDC here has done an incredible study with over 130 individuals on all these different shifts, GPSing them and monitoring how fast they get from point A to point B in the real operational environment. And then we fit that data with metabolic equations to develop a solid understanding of just how hard it is, so we can help them develop some strategic training project or training strategies in the early season. We know the body characteristics. We don't really know the cognitive load. It's really hard to measure stress and vigilance and attention issues out there because the instruments for that are very difficult to take out in the field. We know what the fluid needs are. We know what the energy demands are. We know that the muscle is compromised. We've taken muscle samples from crew members before and after shifts when they were eating MREs to quickly answer the question that MREs should go away in terms of feeding them. We don't know a lot about the muscular strength demands. There's still some gaps in here. And we don't know about the overarching, I didn't even put things like smoke and sleep and other things that they have to deal with, okay? But that's a snapshot that represents some of the gaps. This was a study we did last summer in Alaska with crews out of Fairbanks, and we put this together real fast for a presentation at our national meeting here in June coming up at the American College of Sports Medicine meeting. But what we wanted to look at is how do crews change over the course of the season. This is a high-intensity, hard-working job. The best way for individuals in the normal population to stay healthy is to stay active. There's no shortage of activity when you look at a 5,000 calorie day. Okay, that you think, well, that seems like a pretty physically healthy individual. But this is what happens. So what we did was we measured a number of individuals. We have a system that's a DEXA machine that'll do a whole body scan. It'll break down the body into different components and compartments. We're mostly interested in body fat and fat-free mass or lean body tissue, which this device can collect. They also have a whole body MRI that we scanned all these crew members in. It would be really hard to pull that off down here in the lower 48 unless we found a lab that was willing to let us do that. But at Alaska Fairbanks, they like putting animals in this thing. And so Trey Coker, my colleague, he's like, hey, we want to put some firefighters in there. Can we do that? Yeah, we got the device. No one's using it. So we're scanning for cross-sectional area of the muscle, and we can look right into the liver to look at intrahepatic lipid. So fat content within the liver, which changes depending on diet, changes with alcohol consumption, changes perhaps with smoke, changes with stress, all those different things. The problem that we found was everything went in the wrong direction. So the job is hard, but look at where these numbers go. They get heavier, they get fatter across the body, both in the arm, the leg, and then the trunk, the visceral fat. The lean tissue is not changing. So the muscle mass is not changing. Now that doesn't mean that in some of these individuals it might. It could, but overall they're not changing. The MRI, which is one of the best ways to monitor cross-sectional size of a muscle, is not going down, which is pretty cool. But total cholesterol goes up. LDL cholesterol goes up. But HDL cholesterol was unaffected. So we don't know. When I saw this data, when Coker, my colleague, calls me and says, hey, this is really odd. Here's what's happening. My initial response was, man, that diet sucks. But that's a knee-jerk reaction because all I've studied is the dietary habits. I mean, it's really hard to isolate and partition out all the stresses and assign weights to each one of them. Oh, the reason why we saw this was because 20% was due to diet, 30% was because the sleep was so bad, 40% is due to stress, 10% is due to smoke. We can't partition that out. And it's really hard to assign all that. So we've developed some other strategies moving forward with some studies. But one of the things I'm most excited about, I mean, I love doing these papers. I love doing this research. I love talking to scientists about this and saying, ha, I don't have to stay in the lab all the time, and my lab coat looks different than yours. But scientists don't usually do a very good job of handing off the results of their work. Especially, I mean, we have a hard time talking to scientists and agreeing on something. It's even harder, it's even more of a challenge to say, community that we hope to work with, here are these results. Read my papers and enjoy the graphs. They're not going to do that. My son years ago said to me, Dad, you need to figure out how to make an app or a podcast with some of your research because I don't think very many people are reading your papers. And he was 10 at the time. And so since then, I've tried to become a little bit more cognizant that just emailing a PDF of a paper is not what we need to do. So we started doing these podcasts, and we are absolutely having a blast with these because it's not that expensive. It's very easy to do. And it allows us to talk about the science in a more candid way, in an unscripted way. We don't have a script going into these. We just start and have a conversation. The last one we did was with John McLean, talking about different fires and some of the work that he's done and some of the research that he's done investigating some of these fires. So if you are interested in things besides music on iTunes, you can easily find these at that website, or you can just Google On the Line Podcast for Firefighters. You can pull it up. So that's all I have for my part. And my email should pop up here. Come on. There we go. That's my email if you have any questions, or if you want me to send me any, if you want me to send you any of my papers. And it's muddy on Mount Sentinel these days. So I don't know if we want to ask a few questions now or wait till the very end. Sounds good. All right, I'll transition this over and we'll move forward with our next presenter.
Good. Great. Let me make sure I got my buttons straight here. So before the talk, Brent and I arm wrestled to see who would go first. You can tell by the looks of us who won. I wish I would have gone first because it's going to be a tough act to follow. But no, I'm really happy and quite honored to be here and talk about health effects of wildfire smoke. When I give talks like this, I always think my job's the easiest because it sort of passes the BWOT or bloody well obvious test that this stuff isn't good for you. So in some ways it makes it quite easy for me. I'd like to start with acknowledgments because sometimes I get nervous when I talk, and these guys really contributed a lot to my ability to be here and give this talk. Tony Ward and Curtis Noonan and Aaron Simmons in the School of Community and Public Health have really given me a research home and allowed me to do smoke-related research. It's been quite wonderful to work with them. You know, they were talking about really the idea of these lectures is to show off your university. You really just have a top-notch group in that department. Chris Migliaccio, who runs the iFarm program and is really the driving force behind some of the Seeley Lake studies that we'll talk about. And you may have seen an article in the paper about that last Thursday. Sarah Cofield from the health department. Sarah, to me, is kind of the quintessential public servant. You know, she doesn't just crunch numbers. She really lives the life and helps the community out a lot. If you want to learn a little bit more about Sarah, just Google Sarah's name in the Washington Post from September of last year. Very touching editorial about her life dealing with the smoke events here. And then Amy Sillenberg, who's director of Climate Smart Missoula, is responsible for some of the data that I'll present and obviously does a lot for the community here. As far as talking about health effects of wildfires and smoke, I was really impressed by a comment that Phil Higuera made last week that, you know, over the next century, we're going to probably lose some forest and some acreage across our world, and what the effects are in a broad sense for our habitat and our health. And it reminded me of this quote from Alexander von Humboldt, just looking at the devastation around Lake Valencia and taking down the forests and what it meant for both soil and water and the air that they breathe. If we talk about health effects, obviously we can talk about death of the inhabitants or of our hot shots and the fire crews. We can talk about loss of our livelihood. We can talk about psychological stresses. But we're going to talk all about wood smoke today. This picture is 2 days after this picture. This picture was taken from my backyard in late August, about 2 or 3 miles away from Lolo Peak Fire. And then 2 days later, this is what we dealt with. And we didn't deal with it as bad as some of the areas, obviously. But as far as health-related events, what I hope to talk about today is what it is about smoke that's bad for you, how it hurts you, and some of the things that we can do to mitigate some of those effects. You know, obviously, we're not going to be able to avoid them. These are going to continue. Over the last 5 decades, forest fires have been getting larger, they've been starting earlier, they've been going later, and there's not a whole lot of reason to think that that's going to change over the next 10, 20 years. So what can we do to at least protect ourselves? Particulate matter is the #1 killer of people from an environmental cause in the world. And the World Health Organization estimates that we lose between 350,000 and 600,000 people a year excess deaths just because of particulate matter. And a good portion of that comes from forest fires, as can be seen in this map showing the contribution of forest fires to just particulate matter, 2.5, and then how that overlaps with areas of excess deaths across the world. And of course, we're up here, and we do have some excess deaths, and we should realize that this is kind of old data. You know, it's not including the last 5 years, the 10 years that we've really dealt with stuff. It's not including stuff from California that we had last year, or some of the really devastating fires in Australia and deaths. So it's a big worldwide problem. Coning down to Montana, you're probably aware that we're one of the worst areas in the country for short-term particulate matter. And according to the American Lung Association, we do not meet the short-term recommendations for 25 or PM 2.5. And most of that is attributable to wildfires. So in this top map, it shows that at least 20 to 25% of our PM 25 or 2.5 comes from forest fires, and that 95% of our days that we do not reach those levels are because of wildfires. So it's a problem here in Montana, and will continue to be so. And lest we think this is just a local problem, wildfire smoke goes transcontinental. You know, and that's depending on what the heat of the fire is, the breadth of it, weather conditions, but it's not unusual for this stuff to reach all the way to the East Coast. So wildfire does add to air pollution in general. What is it about smoke that is so harmful? Well, it contains over 1,000 different compounds, including gases and liquids. Carbon monoxide, you know, it's interesting, some of the deaths in California were thought to be because of carbon monoxide poisoning. You know, I think about the hot shots up there and decreases in oxygen and lack of perhaps endurance because of carbon monoxide as well. And a lot of them are volatile, the same things that you breathe in when you breathe in cigarette smoke. Benzene, styrene, formaldehyde, and all these are known to be carcinogens. And there's some data that the lung cancer rate in hot shots and forest fire smokers is higher than that in the general public. So the biggest one as far as bulk goes is particulate matter. And why is it that we follow particulate matter? Well, number one, it's easy. You know, we can see it, we can trace it. It's something that we can monitor fairly quickly compared to other compounds. We're also not sure with all those compounds if they differ. Well, we know they differ from fire to fire. So hardwood forest is probably burning a different set of compounds than pine forest and a different set of compounds than grass fires. There's not a lot of data out there that tell us that it's much different as far as human exposure costs and health events. Particulate matter in particular is divided up into coarse, which is less than 10 microns, or fine, less than 2.5 microns, or very fine, less than 0.1 microns. And these are complicated structures. You know, obviously this has a very large surface area. You know, we think of a lot of it, at least with wildfire, as being soot or carbon, but that kind of surface area can absorb everything that we talked about in the previous slide. And it can also absorb bacteria and transport those into your lung. So what are those sizes relative? I think this is the most famous picture from the EPA, one of the few things that they've helped me with in the last year. But it shows relative size of particulate matter. So the normal human hair is about 50 to 80 microns across. Mine used to be in that range. I think they're quite a bit thinner now. So you could get 5 of the coarse ones across that and 20 of the fine ones across that. So that's what a 2.5 millimeter particle would look like. Relative size, it's about the size of a bacteria or a mold spore. Tobacco smoke and smog runs in the smaller range of that. So these are very, very small particles. The reason that those numbers are important to us is what the aerodynamics of those particles are and where they land in your respiratory tract. And so by and large, the really large particles land in your nasal passages, and the smaller particles make it into the deep lung tissue or the terminal bronchioles. So we're quite worried about those that are less than 10 microns. You can get larger than that into your lung, but most of them that we worry about are less than 10 microns, and that's why we follow that size in particular with some of our regulations. I found this humorous and a little bit comforting. Those of us that have certain grooming problems are protected from asthma because nose hairs do filter out some particles. So perhaps don't spend as much time in front of the mirror and you might be a little bit better off. Particulate matter is one of the 6 deadly substances that the EPA follows. And the regulations have changed. So we started out with one set of regulations in the 70s when the American Lung Association really was the driving force behind this. And those regulations have changed over time as we've learned more and more. They've never gone back up. They always go down. And there's some debate even now as to whether or not we've got the right levels, because our limits are lower than those in the World Health Organization. So when we talk about PM 2.5, or the smallest ones, our primary annual exposure is supposed to be an average of 12 micrograms, and our daily max is supposed to be no more than 35 micrograms. And remember those numbers, because we're going to keep coming back to the 12 and the 35 at some of the other things that I show you. And PM10 is 150 micrograms per meter square in a 24-hour. The World Health Organization recommends as far as a 24-hour exposure, this should be less than 25. Oh, I'm sorry, it is 25. Here it's in the US, it's 35. So we're higher in our limits here than the World Health Organization recommends. Where is that relative to what we are exposed to? Well, again, our average ambient air pollution is right around 10 to 25. Indoor wood smoke and indoor air is generally in the range of 30 to 70. Some of the work that Tony and Curtis and Aaron do show levels that get much above that, but you can think of indoor wood stoves as being in this range. Secondhand smoke is up in the 90 to 120 micrograms per meter square. And then a huge area of concern worldwide is what's happening to indoor air quality when third world countries are using indoor stoves or 3-rock cooking methods. And those levels get quite high, up in the hundreds. There is a direct relationship between frequency of infections and pneumonia and the levels of particulate matter that you breathe. And doing what I do, this is one of my favorite pictures. Being kind of a pulmonologist and geek, this is a lung sample or a histology section through lung, and shows the air spaces or alveoli that you breathe in and out of. And then it shows the partitions between the alveoli. Shows a fairly large blood vessel here, but you actually also have little bitty blood vessels there. Just to give you some idea of how thick that is, it's about 2.5 microns, about the same size as a particulate matter. If you took a piece of saran wrap and cut it crossways, that'd be 20 microns. So your alveolar membrane is about 1/10 the section of a piece of saran wrap, looked dead on. So you can tell it's very fragile and is what you're supposed to get air across. If you do an electron micrograph of that, this is what it looks like. So each of those that I told you was 2.5 is actually made up of a number of different layers. So again, here's your alveolus or your airspace, and for illustration, put some particles in there. This is a capillary, so the oxygen actually weeps across that into the red blood cell. The AM here stands for alveolar macrophage. That's kind of the pus cell of the lungs. So you can tell quite delicate and quite intricate in its structure. The way that particles hurt us are three at least. So number one, those alveolar macrophages or pus cells can actually collect them. Those alveolar macrophages then can actually sneak back across those membranes and enter into the circulation. Particles can land directly on the epithelial cells, that's the outer layer, and those epithelial cells make inflammatory mediators. So once they're damaged, then they release stuff into the body. Particles that can actually then transgress directly into capillaries and then injure endothelial cells or get transported distant into the body. So there are three different ways that you can create these inflammatory mediators, and those are the things that make you feel sick and hurt the rest of your body. Those particles can also increase what are called procoagulants that increase clotting factors. And that's why there's an increased incidence of strokes and heart attacks in people that are exposed to particulate matter. So a lot of ways that it can hurt you. Again, bloody well obvious test, it's not good for you. The other thing that I think is important to realize is that the average adult lung, if you spread it out surface-wise, is the size of a tennis court. And it's sticky. So just imagine blowing smoke across it. You know, a lot of those particles are going to land on that. And the lung, again, is kind of a convoluted maze. So this stuff doesn't get out of there. And if you can compare that then to the average body skin surface area of about a square yard, you know, that's multitudes greater of a surface area that can get inflamed and release stuff into the body. In fact, us ICU docs, when we have a kid that's got bad pneumonia, think of the lung as sort of the engine of inflammation. And again, just compare that to what happens if you get a sunburn and how often you feel. And yet you're only probably burning, if you're keeping most of your clothes on, about, you know, half of that. And just kind of a note, a cigarette filter unfolded wouldn't fill one of those little squares. So, you know, who they trying to fool? We used to have, or at least maybe I had a concept of, when you get a disease, it's because something outside of you gets into you, like an infectious agent, you get pneumonia, bronchiolitis, or if you have something in your environment that hurts you, get other diseases like asthma, COPD, or pneumoconiosis. But the picture is probably more like this, that the environment affects you in ways that set you up for other infections. And it does so by several mechanisms. One of them is altered immunity. We talked about alveolar macrophages sneaking back into the bloodstream, and they release chemicals that alter your other white cells so that you have an altered immunity. Epigenetics. There's a fair amount of data now that particulate matter actually changes the way your DNA is translated. And so you can actually carry this stuff with you for a while. And then there's also some interesting data that it alters your natural bacterial flora. You know, if I take most kids and I swab their nose, I know which bacteria I normally am going to get, and those bacteria actually keep you from getting infections. With inhalation of smoke particles, you change those, and so you get a set of bacteria that it's actually more harmful to you. How do we study this stuff? Well, it's complicated. You know, I think the 3 times you should worry when you're talking to a physician is if he says, in my clinical experience, or we need to run more tests, or it's complicated. So this really is kind of complicated. We're all sort of exposed to ambient air pollution all the time. But on top of that, we have this overlay of indoor pollution from things like wood burning or secondhand tobacco. And so not only do we have to worry about this, as far as attribution, you know, how do we tell what people are exposed to? And then there are people that are exposed to high peaks of particulate matter and air pollution. People like the hot shots and the first responders. There's quite a body of literature from the World Trade Center disaster. And that profile looks more like this, but that sits on top of these two. And then we're talking about wildfire exposures, which is a whole different ballgame. It's very intense, and sometimes it's very prolonged. But how do we really attribute what we're seeing health-wise to that event when we have these other onlays of particulate matter that the people have to deal with? You know, and how do we do that? Well, in the case of wildfires, you can, you know, sort of measure what's around them. Indoors, we have indoor air monitors. They're developing some new devices that you can wear on the person that they're sort of bulky and expensive. And then wildfire exposure, again, it's kind of hard to study because we don't know where they're going to be. And, you know, we'll come back and talk about that as far as how it makes it difficult for us in the area to study really what the health effects of a wildfire exposure is. The things we can study, you know, obviously the simplest thing is mortality things like asthma and COPD, strokes, heart attacks. Less acute things we can measure with healthcare utilization, looking at ER visits or hospital admissions. Symptoms are an easy one, but we don't know what that relates to long term. Blood chemistry changes, you know, we can measure them, but, you know, who's to say that the sexy cytokine for that month is really what causes the disease in a year or two. So how do we know, or do we know, that particulate matter hurts you? I'm going to try and not present a whole lot of graphs because nobody really likes graphs, but I think this is really one of the seminal studies. It was by Dockery et al. In New England Journal in 1993, and they looked at what happened with mortality rates in 6 cities, and it's called the Harvard 6-City Study. The 6 cities were Steubenville, Ohio, that you can't see up there, St. Louis, Harriman, and the cleanest was Portage. And it looked what happened with particulate matter over a 16-year period in several different iterations, and then compared that to mortality over the next 16 years. And there was over a 26% difference between the cleanest city, which happened to be Portage, Wisconsin, and the dirtiest city, which happened to be where I came close to in Steubenville, Ohio. And you can imagine this caused quite a stir because the economics of saying, you know, we really need to clean the air up because it's a public health risk, really was a driving force in lowering some of the standards for particulate matter. It caused enough controversy that in 2004, the Bush administration made an independent company from outside of the U.S. go back and look at all the data. And all the data looked the same. And then to top it off, the same group went back and looked at the data for an additional 26 years. And again, Steubenville, Ohio started up here because of regulations, came down into this range compared to, again, Wisconsin that stayed fairly clean. And yet, the statistics bore out over that period of time. There are a couple of pieces of information to get from that. Number one, we don't know of a safe lower level of particulate matter. It's not like if you cross that 12 microgram threshold or 35 microgram threshold that all of a sudden you're not at risk anymore. You know, we don't really know which of these parameters even is the best one to follow. Is it total cumulative days? Is it total cumulative amount of particles you breathe? Is it high spikes? You know, which of those is worse for you? We don't really know. And then this study was near and dear to my heart. It looked at over 64,000 births around British Columbia and compared particulate matter to the development of asthma. And the take-home message from this data was that of all the air pollutants they looked at, nitric oxide, nitric dioxide, particulate matter, et cetera, particulate matter really was the best predictor of later asthma. Not only that, it was higher if your exposure was prenatal. And so we know that the fetus whose mom is exposed to particulate matter, whether it's through smoking or through chronic exposure, possibly has some detrimental effects to the infants. And as a pediatrician, that's something very important to me. As time has gone on, the literature in this area keeps increasing. You know, now we're dealing with mega fires, which they define as being over 100,000 acres and needing a natural event to downgrade it, like, you know, big rain or snow. And those events are happening worldwide, and there's literature that's coming out of each of these countries: Australia, Brazil, Malaysia, Russia, Europe, the US. And those have been summarized in some fairly good meta-analysis. And again, to kind of spare you a bunch of graphs, the data is really strong that increased exposure to particulate matter from wildfires increases respiratory illnesses such as COPD and asthma. There's very strong data that it increases cardiovascular events such as strokes, MI, and hypertension. There's very strong evidence that this increases the incidence of pneumonia and bronchiolitis. I know that anecdotal medicine is not the best medicine, but anecdotally, this is one of the worst seasons we've had at Community Medical Center for kids being admitted and on ventilators. Our floor has just been chock full this season, and you wonder. We also know that it does affect birth outcomes, and there's data to suggest that it increases rates of prematurity and lower birth weights in infants whose moms are exposed to particulate matter. So what is it that we deal with here? And obviously, Missoula was surrounded by fires on all four sides. And we also have the misfortune of being at the bottom of a inversion layer. This is a great picture that Sarah Cofield supplied to me, showing Chappaqua from 0.6 on September 7th, and you can't see any land down there. So we have to deal not only with the being surrounded, but then being in these valleys where it gets really socked in. And this is what our year looked like last year. The blue line is Missoula, and the orange line is Hamilton. And from the end of July into early September, we did not have very many days in Missoula where we got below the 35 mark. Remember, I kept harping on the 35 mark. And Hamilton perhaps had it as bad, if not worse. Sarah tells me that the break in this line was actually because the machine got clogged. But we should kind of rely on that number probably being at least 140. And compared to other years since 2000, and I wasn't here, but I was told that the year 2000 was a year of legend around here with street lights coming on and really bad smoke. And so, again, we kind of fit 2017 here for Missoula. 2003 was a bad year. This year it lasted a long time. And this was what they put up with in Seeley Lake. This number is the 35 line. This line was where Missoula was. And if you overlay that graph with ours, that's what it looked like. And if you look at cumulative particulate matter exposure, for Missoula, it was really record-breaking. You know, a couple of different ways that you could look at it, either in season duration or cumulative PM2.5 is higher than any of those. But if you look at Seeley Lake, I mean, it was just off the charts. You know, they're talking 5 times what we dealt with in Missoula. And again, part of the reason is their particular geography. They've got a valley with socked in ends of it. So, you know, what they put up with was just unbelievable. Sarah tells me that as far as they know, this is record-breaking for both Canada and US. There's not been that kind of exposure before. And obviously it was a point of big concern, and so the warnings were going out to the community that were very different. It was not only avoid being in Seeley Lake if you can, it was also avoid being there at night, because the smoke's coming indoors, and the smoke at night in Seeley Lake during this event was higher than it was during the day. And this caused quite a stir, obviously, and caused some communications between University of Montana and the health system to see if we could learn anything from this, see if we could at least tell that population what they were going to deal with. And I mentioned that, you know, it's kind of hard research to do because you don't know when the events are going to occur. And so from the timeline of getting contacted in late August to when it took to get our meetings together, to figure out what we were going to look at, to get permission from the Institutional Review Board to getting people trained till September 20th to actually start collecting data. But because of all of this work, the iFarm team, again with Chris Migliaccio and the people in the smoke lab, put together a study which is still ongoing. They put together a health screening thing, went to Seeley Lake and spent some time out there doing pulmonary function tests, blood pressures, vital signs, looking at symptoms of the population, gave away free steak sandwiches. I don't imagine it was smoked pork, but gave away free sandwiches anyhow. Congratulations to them. They apparently have gotten funding. So we'll be making a second visit up there to really try and inform the community as to what their health data was going to be. What they looked at, we looked at, was surveys of symptoms, again, personal information, demographics, heart rate, blood pressure, some of the limitations, small numbers. It was, I think right now we've got 95, no children. And the no children part is simply because of the difficulty of getting things through the Institutional Review Board. It just opens a whole can of worms. But round 2 is pending. Now, what we do know is that during that period of time, their ER visits just about tripled up there. And this is data from the State Department. And I love this slide that Sarah gave to me. So how do you regulate your way out of this? It's not going to take, at least in the immediate time frame, government regulations that turn this around. So, what's been done? Well, number one, advise people to get out of the area if you can, and especially people that are vulnerable, the elderly, known with cardiovascular disease, lung disease, pregnant women, children. That's hard to do. If you're living in Seeley Lake and that's where you work and that's where your home is, it's easy for us to tell you, you need to get out of there. But that's stressful. You got 4 kids, where are you going to go? Now, they did set up some safe sites for them. But, obviously the recommendation of get out of there, there's a whole body of research on what kind of message do you give so people listen to that. And if you look at risk populations, that's 30% of us. The recommendations are over 65. I'm turning 65 this year, so that's me. But children and pregnant, that's 30% of the population that's at risk. Avoid sports practices, exercise. Masks and respirators, you probably already know this, but most masks are not effective for particulate matter. It really needs to be in N95 or an N100. And we don't really practice what we preach. Tony Ward gave me this slide of a very bad day in August of 2015 when this is what it looked like prior to game time. And this is what the air quality looked like. So game time took place right about when the air quality was at its worst. And then the storm came through that night and got things better. But, we still had our football games. So many of the team practices still go on. Outdoor activities should be converted to indoor activities. That's great if you've got an air conditioner or a HEPA filter. It's not so great if you don't have those things, or if your indoor air quality is being deteriorated because of inside tobacco use or cooking or using wood-burning stoves. Nonetheless, there was quite an effort, and really kudos to the people like Amy Sillenberg and groups that donated HEPA filters to Seeley Lake residents and residents in Missoula that couldn't afford to leave or were elderly and didn't have any other routes to clean their air up. And that's Amy there and here. Local measures try and provide some healthy spaces indoors, bowling alleys, theaters, malls, that sort of thing. And again, kudos to Amy Sillenberg. If you go on her website during smoke season, she's got these all mapped out for families. So really a very nice benefit. Provision of health services and school classrooms. This data is from Amy as well, looking at the particulate matter inside of Missoula and Hellgate High School. And so our schools really aren't set up for this yet. But there, again, kudos to the people that did this. They went out and they got a bunch of HEPA filters donated, and all told in these cities, there were 130 filters used at a $25,000 cost. You know, right now our school systems are not set up for this. Just kind of anecdotally, I got a chance to go down and talk in Hamilton at the Rocky Mountain Labs in October because they also were experiencing smoke. And the Rocky Mountain Labs have to have a very high throughput of air because of germs and spores and stuff, and it was overwhelming their system. So all the employees were really worried about what they were being exposed to. But, you know, we should maybe try and get our school systems a little bit better prepared for our children next year. And then, you know, finally getting my political hat on. You know, we have to have a culture of health here. We have to think that air is really important. We have to think that what we do really does affect other people's health. And it's not just now, but in the future, again, kids are getting affected by this. And I always use the term, I think we're building up a national health care debt, because what we're doing that is profitable to us now is perhaps affecting children that 50 years from now then are asthmatics, and they get to pay for what we're doing now. And then think globally, act locally, advocate, advocate, advocate. On the same day that the paper came out and talking about our Wildfire event last Thursday, within those 3 days, these three headlines were out. Trump's plans to ease climate change rules, Trump's EPA moves back on more rules of fuel protection, and Trump picks a Dow Chemical lawyer for a key role at EPA. I think we have to work locally, but also advocate for global changes. So thank you very much for coming tonight. Thank you for your attention, and appreciate the chance to talk with you all.
And let us know if it's Brent or Paul that you wish to speak.
So a question for Paul. Any actual data on the effectiveness or efficaciousness of the HEPA air filters with indoor air versus outdoor air?
Yeah, quite a bit. And again, I'm privileged to be in a department that works on that. Most of the work that I know of that we've done here is in using HEPA filters in homes that are wood-burning stoves. And they're at least 75% effective given the right filter in the right room used the right way. So different HEPA filters have different capacities of air moving through them, but they're really quite effective at decreasing PM 2.5.
Paul, I have a follow-up question to that. There were no HEPA air filters to be found late last summer, and I had heard that if you put a furnace filter with a small particulate range on the back of a box fan, it would work in the same way. Is that correct or not?
I don't know of any data to say that. One of the interesting things that I'm aware of from Tony Ward and Curtis Noonan's work, part of that study used what we called a placebo filter that was not an effective HEPA filter. And that still decreased especially some of the coarse particulate matter. I don't know how well a fan blowing through a filter in a room will really work if it's just an air-conditioned filter. I suppose it may get some big soot out of there, but I doubt very much it's going to be very effective for HEPA. And I'm going to kind of glance at Curtis. And yes?
Yeah, it's also a possible fire risk.
Yeah, very good point. Curtis also added that it'd be kind of a fire risk to do that. So, yeah.
Has there any kind of work been done trying to develop filters for firefighters? Simple easy to carry type things that really work, because handkerchiefs just don't do it.
The guy that should ask that, you should ask that to is sitting down here, Brian Sharkey. He's done a lot of work historically trying to think about those things. And the problem with a lot of the current designs is when the metabolic demands get to be what they are typically, they're too restrictive to flow. And so it makes the movement of air more difficult, which adds more load to the crew member, which might exaggerate everything from cardiovascular load to heat stress. So it's either they got to slow way, way down, or something else has got to happen in terms of a new design.
I had a question that's kind of a follow-up to that last one, actually. Just based on where those firefighters were stationed at Seeley Lake, right down in the valley, camping in an open grass field for weeks at a time, is there a study going on now to just see how multiple weeks of that level of exposure was affecting those firefighters?
Not from our end, but we have a project that we're trying to move forward that, I mean, it's not difficult for us to collect any type of sample in those settings. So if there are collaborators that want to play with us and say, hey, how can we get some of those samples? We can easily get them. That's not hard. It's just a matter of coming up with the appropriate research question and the timing for what samples you want to capture and when you want to capture them and what they mean. But it's just an acute snapshot of, say, here's before the shift when you were in a cleaner environment, like in a camp perhaps that was cleaner, and now you're in the smoke for 12 hours, and you come back to camp and we get another sample, and there's a change. What does that change mean? What does it indicate? It's really difficult to identify acute changes in global measures of pulmonary function, things like that. That's not my area whatsoever, but compared to like small changes in certain biomarkers, those might go up dramatically, but it's hard to pinpoint precisely what those jumps in biomarkers mean. Because you can do one study and some of those biomarkers may simply go up because of exercise. Some of those biomarkers may go up as a function of exercise and smoke and sleep and bad diet. And so it's really hard to map out what the best way to study it is.
It's complicated.
It's complicated.
Brent, toward the end of your lecture, you presented a slide that looked at metabolic markers for firefighters who'd gone a whole season. And at the end of the season, it looked to me like they'd maintained lean body mass and they'd maintained a good level of HDLs, all of which suggests their eating instincts were good as compared to the work they had to do. But the concern was that their fat content and their weight had gone up, and there's some reasons suggested for that. Did you look at them? They don't just sit down at the end of the fire season. These are people who are chronic athletes, if you will. So did you look at those same markers 4 or 6 months later?
That's a good, I'm working on a proposal for that very concept, is to look at the preseason, postseason, but then the reset. The hard part with that sometimes is if you start out with 100 subjects, it's easy to get all 100 of them preseason. You might get 75 at the end of the season because they scatter fast. And then not all of them are going to come back, and so you might end up with 50 at the reset, because not all the crew members come back or they shift to another one. It's like, we can't chase everybody. But you're right, we have a plan to do seasonal and off-seasonal reset metrics, and some of those are cardiovascular risk profiles, markers of oxidative stress that a colleague, John Quindry, that's his area of wizardry. Yeah, because then you can see if there's an acute drop, acute being the whole season, and then the rehab, so to speak. My gut feeling is that there is some level of rehab. because they come back, I don't know to what level they come back, but certainly fitness levels, just talking to crews, the fit individuals that start the season become less fit and more frustrated. And so they do everything they can to reset themselves towards their goal of fitness and training habits in that off season. And some say it takes them the rest of the season to get back to their fighting weight, and then they got to do it all over again.
Paul? Here. Over here. Paul, do you have any sense of how long after a fire season has moved on, a child, and this is in a way related to the previous question, a child still has the symptoms or the ailments or, the deficits that
Yes.
came as a result of exposure?
Yeah, sense is probably the best word. I'm still seeing kids that the parents say they just didn't recover, that they're still coughing. They started coughing in August and it just hasn't let up. And I always use the analogy with those parents that it's sort of like sunburn of the lung. And anytime I do a bronchoscopy and actually look in their airways, they're red and they're inflamed. And that goes on for a while. There is a little bit of sense that some of that does recover and some of that comes out of California pollution data, that if you do decrease pollution levels in those areas, in about 2 or 3 years, it seems like their lung function is recovered. But in that period of time, with at least chronic exposure to particulate matter, their lung function is not that of their cohorts that are of equal age and race and socioeconomics. So, again, it's complicated. Are you talking about a short window or are you talking about a high spike? And I think one of the hardest part about doing studies like that is really knowing what any individual child is exposed to in terms of true micrograms that are in and out of the house, they're playing, their parents smoke or they don't smoke. But again, anecdotally, I'm still seeing kids that the parents say, they started coughing and they've not quit coughing. So I think it takes months, with the kind of exposure that we had this year.
This question's for Paul. Actually, kind of tails off of what you were just talking about, and that is, is there a difference that you see from like an urban type of air pollutant versus a smoke type inhalant, or even places that are urban settings may have some smoke blow in, like Seattle or Vancouver, places like that? The differences between those types of pollutants and the health effects?
That I'm aware of, there's not a lot of data that has compared wildfire exposure to inner city chronic exposure. The best data that I know of is actually looking at distance from roadways, which is very closely related to particulate matter and very closely related to long-term lung events. I don't know how to compare Missoula to Cleveland. And that's always a criticism of the data that I showed even from the Harvard 6 studies. Is it something else in that community? In Steubenville, Ohio, you're under stress because you root for the Cleveland Browns. They can deteriorate many of our health, but many people in Steubenville actually root for Pittsburgh, which has been doing pretty good. So the short answer is no. I don't know of any data that has compared wildfire smoke or compared different types of wildfire smoke as far as outcomes to inner city pollution.
Yeah, your picture of Washington Stadium and the game shall go on. Do you think that there has been a sea change in attitude towards what was happening 3 years ago and let's say next year? So I thought it was interesting. We're not going to let high school seniors play, but we're going to let college freshmen play. And 3 months difference in ages?
Well, I have no idea if they're making any policy shifts here. People are as rabid about their Grizz team as they are about Hellgate. I'm afraid, so I have no idea the inner workings here, what they've decided that way. Not to duck your question, I just don't know.
A question for Brent. Did you compare in your studies working at night firefighting to working in the daytime?
I think we had one of our crews in one of our feeding studies that before we got there got shifted to a night detail. And so we had to shift our whole schedule. We're not used to collecting data in the daylight. We're used to collecting it in the morning when it's dark, in the evening when it's dark. The interesting thing, if you study people night shift or day shift, we're still stuck in the dark. Because it's late at night when they start, it's dark, and then when they come back in, it's still dark. So, but we have had only that one night shift in one of the feeding studies, and we saw the exact same pattern in terms of how altering the nutritional delivery intervals, it was a mirror image of the day studies. So, but things like risk for injury or slips, trips, and falls and those things, we have not monitored any of that. But the work output metrics as captured from the accelerometer systems that we've used, the blood data, the changes in body weight, the water turnover, those are almost the same in both situations. So.
All right, I've been notified that the time for adjournment has arrived. Thank you very much for being here. Next week, we're going to go a little bit different. We're going to move away from wildfires and forest fires and health and so on, and we're going to talk a little bit about information that we receive and how we process them. And again, that's to stay true to our theme of what's the real deal behind the headlines. So look forward to seeing you next week.